Clara had never thought much about imaginary friends. When Theo, her 5-year-old brother, first mentioned Nico, she had brushed it off as normal. After all, Theo had always been a playful, creative kid. He'd spend hours in his room, talking to himself, setting up elaborate games with his toys. His laughter would echo down the old wooden halls of their home, and for a while, it seemed harmless, even charming. But as time went on, things changed. Their home, a century-old house in Salem, Massachusetts, was a reminder of a time long past. The air inside always seemed cooler, the shadows a little deeper. The creaking floors and rattling windows were constants, but they'd become so familiar to Clara that she barely noticed them anymore. To outsiders, the house might seem eerie, but for her, it was just home. It was the place she had lived her entire life, with its uneven walls and slightly slanted ceilings, a space where her mother's absence lingered like an unwelcome guest. Since her mother passed, Clara had taken on the role of caretaker. Her father, Greg, coped with the loss by burying himself in work. He spent long hours at the office, leaving Clara alone to handle the house, and more importantly, Theo. Clara adored her little brother. With his mop of dark curls and big, curious eyes, Theo was the kind of child who saw wonder in everything. At least, he used to. Lately, Theo had become quieter. Not in the usual way children grow up and lose interest in things, but in a way that made Clara uneasy. He was still talking to Nico, only now, their conversations seemed different, darker. Clara first noticed the change when she found a drawing on the kitchen table. It was Theo's unmistakable scribble, a black crayon sketch of a figure standing tall, looming over 2 smaller figures. The larger figure had no face, just hollow eyes. "Who's this?" she had asked, holding it up. Theo, sitting at the table with his peanut butter sandwich, smiled. "It's Nico. He said he wants to meet you." Clara had laughed it off, tousling Theo's hair. Well, maybe one day. But she couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in her chest. The drawing wasn't what a 5-year-old usually made. There was something deliberate about it, something unsettling. She told herself it was just her imagination, playing tricks on her in the quiet moments when the weight of their mother's absence became too much. Still, the drawings kept coming. Clara would find them tucked into the most unexpected places, under the couch cushions, inside the pages of her textbooks, once even on the ceiling of Theo's room. That one had stopped her cold. How had he gotten up there? When she asked him, Theo just giggled. "Nico did it. He's really tall." Their father wasn't much help. "He's a kid, Clara," Greg said one evening, his eyes glazed over with exhaustion. "Kids have imaginations. It's normal. Let him have this." But Clara couldn't just dismiss it. She started to feel like she was being watched. Every time she walked past Theo's room, she felt eyes on her, though she never saw anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes, she'd hear Theo talking to Nico late at night, his voice hushed, as if they were sharing secrets. One night, she pressed her ear to the door trying to make out the words. What she heard made her stomach flip. "He says he's coming for her soon," Theo whispered, the words chillingly clear. Clara's breath hitched, and she stepped back, her heart racing. She stood in the dark hallway staring at the door, her hand frozen on the knob. It was just Theo's imagination, that's all. But the sound of his soft voice continued, muffled by the door, and Clara felt the growing weight of something she couldn't quite explain. Days passed, and Clara's unease grew. It wasn't just Theo's behavior anymore. It was the house. The once familiar creaks and groans now seemed more deliberate, more menacing. She'd hear footsteps upstairs when she knew she was alone, or catch a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, only to find nothing there when she turned. One evening, she found another drawing. This one was taped to the back of her bedroom door. It was of her, and beside her, a tall, shadowy figure stood with outstretched arms, faceless but watching. Clara couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was just stressed, taking on too much with Theo in the house and school. But even as she told herself these things, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That weekend, while Theo was at a playdate, Clara decided to clean out the attic, a task she'd been putting off for weeks. It wasn't long before she found an old box of VHS tapes, labeled with her mother's handwriting. Feeling nostalgic, she pulled out the one marked Christmas 2012 and loaded it into the player. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of their living room, decorated with lights and stockings. There was her mother, smiling as she helped a younger Theo open his presents. Clara's heart ached watching them. She fast-forwarded through the tape, pausing occasionally to see moments she'd long forgotten. But then, something caught her eye. In the background, by the hallway, there was a figure. Clara rewound the tape and hit play, her eyes glued to the screen. There it was again, a small shadowy shape, barely visible, standing at the edge of the frame, just beyond where the Christmas tree lights reached. It didn't move, it just stood there, watching. Clara's skin prickled as she paused the tape, the figure frozen on the screen. She hadn't noticed it before. No one had. But now, staring at it, she felt an icy fear creeping up her spine. She rewound the tape again, to when Theo had been sitting in front of the tree, babbling about his toys. And there it was, the same shadowy figure, standing in the exact same spot, as if it had always been there, waiting. Her heart raced as she turned off the TV and sat in silence. The image of the figure burned into her mind. Who, or what, had been watching them that Christmas morning, and why had no one seen it before? Later that night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the drawings, about Theo's strange behavior, and then she remembered what he had said the other day. Nico says he's coming for her soon. Her breath caught in her throat. Theo hadn't been talking about their mother. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Ever since she found that shadowy figure in the old Christmas tape, the house felt different, darker, more suffocating. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in around her, as if every corner hid something just out of sight, waiting for her to look away. She couldn't get the image out of her mind. That dark figure standing so still, so silent, in the background of her family's happiest moments. She didn't tell her father. What was the point? Greg had become a ghost himself, working late into the night, coming home long after Theo had gone to bed, and Clara was left alone with her thoughts. He was still grieving, still lost in his own world, and anything Clara said would just sound like nonsense to him. Besides, it wasn't like she had any proof, just a feeling that gnawed at her, growing worse with each passing day. Theo was still talking about Nico. If anything, he talked about him more. Clara would overhear him having full conversations when he thought no one was listening, his little voice muffled through the walls, as though Nico were sitting right there beside him. Sometimes, Clara would hear Theo laughing, the sound echoing in the quiet halls, and it chilled her to the bone. Because the laughter was wrong, forced, like Theo was pretending to enjoy whatever Nico was saying. One afternoon, while Theo was napping, Clara sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had tried to look up information about imaginary friends, hoping to find something that would ease her mind, but everything she read felt hollow, inadequate. None of it explained what she was seeing, what she was feeling. None of it accounted for the fear that had wrapped itself around her like a heavy blanket. Then, on a whim, she typed Nico into the search bar, followed by Salem. The results were strange. Buried among pages of unrelated articles and irrelevant information was a mention of an old legend, a story she had never heard before despite growing up in the town. A story about an entity that preyed on children, an entity that showed itself only to those young enough to still believe in the impossible. It wasn't much, just a passing reference in a poorly written blog post, but it made Clara's skin crawl. The entity, according to the post, didn't have a name. It didn't need one. But some children, when asked to describe it, had called it something like Nico. Clara stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She scrolled through the article again, trying to find more, but there was nothing, just a vague story passed down through generations. No dates, no names, no concrete details. It was enough, though, to leave her shaken. She needed answers, but she didn't know where to turn. So she did the only thing she could think of. She emailed Mrs. Meredith, her history teacher. Mrs. Meredith was known for being a bit of an oddball, with her obsession over Salem's history and all its strange, spooky past. But Clara had always liked her. She was kind, understanding, and, more importantly, she had access to the town's historical archives. Clara wrote the email quickly, not giving herself time to second-guess what she was doing. She kept it short, vague. She didn't want Mrs. Meredith thinking she was crazy, after all. She simply asked if Mrs. Meredith knew anything about old legends involving children and imaginary friends in Salem, particularly anything involving a figure called Nico. After she hit send, she sat back and stared at the screen, the feeling of dread creeping up on her again. It was a long shot, but at least she was doing something. The next day, Mrs. Meredith responded. Clara's heart raced as she opened the email. The response was brief, just a couple of lines. Clara, I don't know much about Nico, but there's something you should see. Can you come by after school tomorrow? There are old records in the library that might interest you. Clara's stomach twisted with a mix of relief and anxiety. Finally, someone was taking her seriously, but at the same time, she wasn't sure she wanted to know more. The truth was terrifying enough as it was. That evening, as she tucked Theo into bed, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. Theo seemed calm, almost too calm, as though he was completely at peace with everything happening around him. As she leaned down to kiss his forehead, he grabbed her wrist, his small fingers wrapping around her tightly. Nico says you shouldn't go to the library tomorrow, Theo whispered, his voice eerily steady. He says you won't like what you find. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She pulled her hand away slowly, trying not to show how much his words rattled her. It's okay, Theo, she said softly, her voice trembling just slightly. Nico doesn't know everything, but as she left his room, closing the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Nico did. The next day at school, Clara couldn't concentrate on anything. Her mind was completely consumed by what Theo had said, by what she might find at the library. By the time the final bell rang, she was practically running to Mrs. Meredith's classroom. Mrs. Meredith greeted her warmly, though Clara could see the concern etched into her features. You look like you haven't slept in days, Clara, she said, gesturing for Clara to sit down. Is everything all right? Clara hesitated. She didn't want to unload everything onto Mrs. Meredith. She barely understood it herself, but the weight of it was too much to carry alone. So she told her, piece by piece, about Theo, about Nico, about the strange things she'd seen and heard in the house. She even mentioned the figure in the Christmas tape, though she felt foolish saying it out loud. To her surprise, Mrs. Meredith didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns. She just listened, her expression growing more serious with every word. When Clara finished, Mrs. Meredith was silent for a long moment. I don't know what's going on in your house, she said finally, her voice low. But I've come across stories like this before. Salem has a long history, and not all of it is about witches and trials. There are darker things in this town's past, things people have forgotten or chosen to forget, but some of it is still there, buried in the old records. Mrs. Meredith stood and motioned for Clara to follow her. Together, they made their way to the school's library, a place Clara rarely visited. It was quiet, too quiet, and as they walked between the tall shelves of dusty books, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. They reached the back of the library, where Mrs. Meredith unlocked a small door leading to a storage room. Inside were boxes of old documents, some of them dating back to the 1600s. Mrs. Meredith pulled out a file, its edges yellowed with age, and handed it to Clara. These are old records from when the town was first settled, Mrs. Meredith explained. There are stories here, accounts of strange occurrences, missing children, sightings of things that can't be explained. Some of it is folklore, but there are patterns. Clara opened the file and began sifting through the papers. There were handwritten accounts, old newspaper clippings, and photographs that looked as though they had been taken decades ago. As she read through them, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Children disappearing. Always children. And always, there were whispers of an imaginary friend who had appeared in their lives just before they vanished. One account from 1893 described a boy who had begun speaking to an unseen companion he called Nick, who no one else could see. His parents wrote it off as a phase, but within weeks, the boy began drawing strange, disturbing images, much like Theo's. He claimed his friend had shown them to him. Not long after, the boy was found dead in his room. No signs of injury, no explanation, just gone. Clara's hands trembled as she read the account. There were others, all eerily similar, And then she found a name. One of the children who had disappeared had lived in her house, back when it had been part of a larger estate. The boy's name was Jeremy, and he had vanished in 1924. His parents had written about his friend, a shadowy figure who Jeremy claimed lived in the attic. The attic. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Could it be possible? Could the figure in the attic be Nico? Mrs. Meredith must have seen the look on her face because she placed a hand on Clara's arm. "I know this is hard to believe," she said gently, "but these things have happened before, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Theo is talking to someone or something named Nico." Clara swallowed hard. "What do I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Meredith's expression was grave. "You need to break the connection. Whatever Nico is, he's dangerous. He's feeding off Theo's mind, his soul. If you don't stop him, he'll take Theo just like he took the others." Clara nodded, though her mind was reeling. How was she supposed to fight something she couldn't even see? Something that had been haunting children for generations. As she left the library, the weight of the truth pressed down on her. She had to protect Theo, but she had no idea how. And she couldn't help but feel that Nico was already one step ahead of her. That night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness of her room feeling heavier than usual. The house was silent, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of silence that made her skin crawl, the kind that pressed down on her chest and made it hard to breathe. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nico's shadow lurking in the corners of her mind, always just out of reach. She felt like she was being watched, like the house itself was alive with some dark energy. Then she heard it, Theo's voice, faint, coming from his room. He was talking again, his words too soft to make out. Clara felt her stomach twist with dread. She didn't want to go in there, didn't want to hear what he was saying to Nico, but she had to. She had to protect him. Slowly, she got out of bed and padded down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached Theo's door and pressed her ear to it, her hand trembling on the knob. And then she heard it, a voice, but it wasn't Theo's. It was deeper, raspier, like the sound of dry leaves rustling in the wind. Clara's hand hovered on the door, trembling as she listened. The voice on the other side was unmistakably not Theo's. It was low and scratchy, the kind of sound that raised the hairs on the back of your neck. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from that door as possible. But she couldn't. Theo was in there. She turned the knob slowly, her heart pounding in her ears, and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Theo was sitting up in bed, facing the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. He was talking softly, almost like he was whispering a secret, but it wasn't his voice that sent chills down Clara's spine. It was the voice responding to him. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, barely visible in the dim light from Theo's nightlight. It wasn't clear, like it was made of smoke and darkness, its form flickering and shifting as it moved. It had no face, just those hollow black eyes she'd seen in Theo's drawings. Nico. Theo was speaking to it as if nothing was wrong, as if this nightmare figure wasn't standing at the foot of his bed. "Nico says it's okay," Theo murmured, not looking at Clara. "He says we can all be friends now." Clara stepped into the room, her heart pounding so loudly she thought Theo must hear it. She wanted to scream, to grab Theo and run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The figure in the corner, Nico, turned its head slowly toward her, its dark eyes locking onto hers. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thickening, pressing in on her chest. She had to say something, do something. "Theo," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Come here." Theo didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Nico, entranced, as though he couldn't look away. Clara's throat tightened, fear wrapping around her like a cold, suffocating fog. Nico shifted again, its form rippling as if it were made of liquid darkness. It took a step forward, toward Clara, and for the first time she felt the overwhelming presence of something far older, far darker than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just an imaginary friend. This was something ancient, something malevolent. "Theo," she said, louder this time, her voice shaking. "Come here now." Theo blinked, his trance breaking for a moment. He turned to look at her, confusion clouding his little face. "But Nico says..." I don't care what Nico says. Clara's voice was trembling, but she forced herself to stay calm. Come to me. Now. Theo hesitated, his small hands clutching the blanket. Behind him, Nico seemed to grow taller, its form stretching unnaturally, filling the room with its shadow. It whispered something, too soft for Clara to hear, but Theo's eyes widened, and he turned back to it, his expression torn between fear and something else, something almost like loyalty. Clara couldn't wait any longer. She rushed forward, grabbed Theo by the arm, and yanked him out of bed. He let out a small cry of protest, but Clara didn't stop. She pulled him out of the room, slamming the door behind them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Theo struggled against her, but she held on tightly, dragging him down the hallway toward her room. "Let me go," he cried, his voice high-pitched and panicked. "Nico will be mad. He's my friend." Clara spun him around, crouching down so she could look him in the eyes. "Theo, listen to me," she said, her voice urgent. "Nico isn't your friend. He's not real, okay? He's dangerous. You have to stay away from him." Theo's lip quivered, his eyes welling up with tears. "But he said he'd protect me. He said you didn't understand." Clara's heart ached at the confusion on his face, but there was no time to explain everything now. She pulled him into her room and shut the door, locking it behind them. She knew it wouldn't keep Nico out, but it made her feel just a little safer, if only for a moment. Theo sat on the edge of her bed, his small frame shaking with silent sobs. Clara knelt in front of him, trying to keep her own fear in check. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We're going to figure this out." But deep down, she wasn't sure. The terror that had filled her when she saw Nico was like nothing she had ever felt before. It wasn't just fear. It was a cold, consuming dread that seemed to reach into her very soul. She had to get help. She couldn't do this alone. Her thoughts raced as she sat on the floor, leaning against the door. She couldn't just wait for something worse to happen. But what could she do? She had already tried looking up information online, and all she had found were vague references to old legends. She needed more than that. Mrs. Meredith. Clara's breath caught as she remembered the history teacher's words. You need to break the connection, but how? Clara wasn't sure what Mrs. Meredith had meant, but it was her only lead. She grabbed her phone and quickly typed out a message, her fingers shaking. "I need your help. Please. I don't know what to do." As she sent the message, she glanced over at Theo. He had calmed down a little, but his eyes were wide, his hands trembling in his lap. "Are we going to be okay?" he whispered, his voice small and frightened. Clara forced a smile. "Yeah," she said, even though she wasn't sure. "We'll be okay." But as the minutes ticked by, and the shadows in her room seemed to grow darker, deeper, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. For her, for Theo, for all of them. Mrs. Meredith responded within minutes. "Meet me at the school. I'll be waiting." Clara didn't waste any time. She grabbed a jacket, told Theo to stay close, and led him out of the house. As they stepped into the cool night air, Clara cast one last glance back at the house. The windows were dark, but she could feel Nico watching, waiting. She could feel his presence lingering, like a shadow that stretched across everything she loved. The drive to the school felt longer than it should have. Every shadow on the road seemed to twist and move in ways it shouldn't. Clara kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see Nico sitting in the back seat. Those empty eyes staring back at her. Theo was quiet, his small hand gripping her arm tightly as if he, too, sensed that the danger wasn't far behind. When they arrived, Mrs. Meredith was already there, standing outside the entrance to the school's library. She looked different, more serious, more afraid. Without a word, she ushered them inside and led them down the familiar halls to the library, locking the door behind them. "There's something I haven't told you," Mrs. Meredith began, her voice low and hurried. "I've been researching more about Nico. There's a pattern. Every child he latches onto, they disappear. Their minds, it's like they're erased. Their souls are taken. Clara, Nico isn't just an imaginary friend. He's a parasite. He preys on children, feeding on their innocence, their fear. And once he's strong enough, he takes them," Clara finished, her voice hollow. Mrs. Meredith nodded, her eyes dark with fear. "Yes, and Theo, he's next." Clara's stomach dropped. She had known on some level that this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. "So how do we stop him?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "There has to be a way to break the connection." "There is," Mrs. Meredith said, though she sounded unsure. "But it's dangerous. You have to confront him. Force him out. If you can weaken him enough, he'll lose his hold on Theo." "But Clara..." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to Theo. "Nico is strong. He feeds on fear. And if you're not careful, he'll take you too." Clara swallowed hard, her hands shaking. She didn't have a choice. She had to do this. For Theo. For herself. "Tell me what to do." Mrs. Meredith led them deeper into the library, to a small, hidden room Clara had never noticed before. Inside was a circle of candles, and in the center, a small, old-looking book with symbols Clara didn't recognize. "This is where you'll face him," Mrs. Meredith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once the candles are lit, Nico will be drawn here. But remember, he's going to try to break you. He'll use everything against you. Don't let him in." Clara's heart raced as she knelt inside the circle, Theo sitting beside her, wide-eyed and trembling. Mrs. Meredith lit the candles one by one, and as the last flame flickered to life, Clara felt a cold gust of wind whip through the room, and then, from the shadows, Nico appeared. He wasn't smoke anymore, he was real. His form solidified, his hollow eyes gleaming in the candlelight as he stepped forward, a grin spreading across his face. He looked down at Theo, then up at Clara, his smile "I knew you'd come," his voice like nails on glass. "You can't stop this. I'm too strong." Theo is my note. Clara's hands balled on my space, her nails digging into her palms. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, the terror rising in her chest, but she fought it back. Had to stay calm, or she had to be strong. Leave him alone. Voice shocking but firm. "He's not yours." Nico laughed, the sound echoing around the room. "You think you can protect him? You can't even protect yourself." Clara closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel Nico's presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. But then she remembered Mrs. Meredith's words. "He feeds on fear. Don't let him in." She opened her eyes and stared at Nico, her fear melting into anger. "You're not real," she said, her voice stronger now. "You're nothing." For a moment, Nico's form flickered, his grin faltering. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can get rid of me?" he hissed, his voice cold and venomous. "I've been here for centuries. I've taken so many before Theo. What makes you think you're any different?" But Clara didn't waver. She stood, pulling Theo to his feet beside her, and stepped out of the circle. Nico snarled, his form growing darker, more monstrous. Lucas's vision blurred, the world around him spinning as the words echoed in his mind. His heart raced, his breath coming in short. Panicked gasps as the figure reached out toward him, its fingers long and twisted, its smile still locked in place. And then, everything went black.